Joining us now is Jonathan Smucker. He's the co-founder of Lancaster Stands Up, PA Stands Up, Common Defense, and Beyond the Choir. He's also a PhD student in sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining me. How are you this morning?
Hey, I'm good. Good to be with you, Ben.
Good to be speaking with you again. We spoke previously on the podcast version of my work, and we had an in-depth conversation that I think is even more pertinent now. We spoke previously about organizing the left. And you phrased it actually in a way. You said that progressivism is on the ascendancy, and at the time when you said it, it didn't feel like that. And I think even now there are a lot of progressives or leftist people who are really interested in liberation, interested in all these values that we both have in common. I think they also feel like this is perhaps not a good time for progressivism because the Democratic establishment is in power. What are your thoughts on that general area?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's complicated, right? And I think one of the tensions in political organizing work is we have to balance between actually like not being patient, right? Like we have to make pressing demands and we have to demand things now. And at the same time, I think internally we have to take a long view of how dynamic the situation is right now and how things are changing. And so, establishment Dems are in charge. Well, what else is new in that regard, right? The old guard of the Democratic Party, people who made their careers coming up, in the Reagan era, right? Mm-hmm. They've been neoliberals, right? Folks who have been, I know that word gets thrown around a lot, but we're talking about people who went along with free trade, people who went along with, all the Republican rhetoric on so many things, tough on crime, welfare queens, welfare reform, all these racist dog whistles, the expansion of the criminal justice system in this country, the continuing gutting of social programs, the colossal failure on healthcare. These were both Republican and Democratic administrations for the past 40 years. So when people are like, well, the Democratic establishment, they're at the helm, that's true. That's not new. But what is new is they're not as much at the helm as they used to be. And we've got a really important foothold and power. We've got, people talk about the squad, people talk about Senator Sanders, and we should be talking about them. And we should be talking about our movements that got them there. And, folks right. are. And so I guess where I'm going with this is, I was very much for Bernie Sanders. I did as much as I could to get him elected, like so many folks. I think Bernie could have won this year. I think the establishment forces that we were up against last year, were formidable. But there was a time when the campaign was navigating that, and it looked like, he was the front runner. So I think we were in the margin of maneuver. And to be in the margin of maneuver, that means the margin in which tactics and strategy can flip the outcome one way or another is huge, right? And the crop of leaders and of folks in Congress and the strength of our movement, it's totally different. It's a different world than when Obama came into power in 2009, where all that stuff was weak.
Let's dig in there real quick because you've said quite a few things there. Like there was we were within the margin of maneuver, and I like that way of thinking of it. But I want to back up to something else that you said. Like we're having to learn how to balance not being too patient, right? Being impatient, as well as balancing the complexities of this moment. Can you unpack that more? Because yes, we need to strike. We need to do something now. But how do you frame that in the context of the complexities we're dealing with in terms of the Democratic establishment?
Absolutely. So I think that there's a couple of different logics at work here that are in tension with each other. So as political organizers, so that's my background. I've been a political organizer for the past 25 years. And, I was raised working class, rural, and I'm organizing here in rural Pennsylvania, where, you well, it's a different world, the bases that we're moving, right? So the movements that we're organizing here in Pennsylvania, as I see other places across the country, what we've got to do is we have to make things urgent, because things are urgent, right? Especially right now with the COVID crisis, poor people, working class people, people of color, people are, it's a dire situation. And so we need to, and not just that, just like all the things that our movements have been struggling with. We're talking about the trial right now, earlier on the episode, and that urgency is in communities that are directly impacted. So we need to make that sense of urgency out there. And to do that, sometimes we have to simplify things in terms of our messaging. We have to create that urgency. There's not a lot of room on Twitter, for example, or in an 8-second soundbite when you're talking to the mainstream press to get that nuance out. You've got to, and that's not the point. You've got to mobilize people. You've got to talk in moral language. But internally, we have to really map what's different right now. We have to map the specifics. Like, let's take the bill that's being voted for today, the relief bill, right?
Yeah.
A lot of us have been working for years to get a $15 an hour minimum wage. I think we're going to get that eventually. We better. But it was maddening to see 8 Democratic senators vote against it. And before that, also to see, Chuck Schumer, Biden, Harris not, overrule the parliamentarian or fire the parliamentarian. All that stuff, like they should have done that, right? It's maddening that they didn't. So we need to make noise about that. At the same time, we have to look at this relief bill and compare it to the stimulus in 2009 and how, Biden basically told Larry Summers to, I don't know if I can swear on this show, so
go help himself.
And that it's, this is going to increase the income of the poorest Americans in the country by 20%. I mean, it's significant. It's a big win, and it's a win that would not have happened without the organizing, without the movements, without our champions in Congress reframing the debate over the past 5 years. And so the last thing I'll say on this is I think this is related to this question of creating urgency and also having a nuanced analysis for our own strategic thinking, right? We also, as movements, have to learn how to celebrate partial victories, because almost always in this work, our victories are partial. And it's hard to celebrate a partial victory when there's a really important thing that we didn't win. There's a really important way that we fell short.
Let's talk about the differences here, right? Because you said we have to speak in moral language, especially in these sound bites, the mainstream media. But even in some of the longer, broader conversations, the online conversations, the YouTube conversations, the panels, and all these things, we are met with a level of reductionism that doesn't allow for nuance from our side, from the progressive side, from people who ostensibly are fighting for the same things that we are, but yet and still, when you have organizers, right? Organizers such as yourself, organizers in the South, the people who actually helped win Georgia, it's almost mandatory that they think and operate in a nuanced way. And you have this imbalance where the people who are out there doing the work have the nuance because, well, the work requires it. But even in some of our independent media, we don't have that nuance. So where do you find a balance there, or what is your message to that dichotomy?
Yeah, I think, and the last conversation you were having with Torain, is that how?
Torain Walker.
Torain, sorry. I have a book by Torain on my shelf. There was getting at some of this, the tension in activism and organizing between the visible part, right, and that kind of there's a journalist, Zainab Tafechi. She talks about the economy of attention that's online, and I think it's having this is not all media, social media. It's so important, right? It's how people make meaning of things. We have to contend in it. This is not making an argument against engaging with it. But on some level, what it's doing is it is really invisibilizing the on the ground organizing and power building and giving a lot of people, I think, a false impression of how politics works, right? So on the ground, right, we're talking about knocking on people's doors, finding volunteers, finding people who are leaders. How do you find a leader? Well, they have followers, right? They have people that they influence, finding them, aligning them, developing their leadership, inviting them into leadership, making a field map of which neighborhoods you're going to knock, how you're going to build groups, all this stuff. It's hard work, right? So in some ways, it's kind of like the workhorses and the show horses, right? Like that's a metaphor for this, that hard work that doesn't translate into social media. It's not sexy. People don't retweet it. And so there's a real tension between that kind of in-depth, and it's not easy to learn too. There's a whole skill set that's invisible. I mean, people can learn it by stepping into it, right? It's not like, but it's like, it's a whole area of work and political skills that our movements really need to learn if we're going to be powerful, if we're going to get more champions in Congress and do more in the coming years.
What do you say then to when we get these champions, quote unquote champions in office, right? What level of accountability can we actually hold them to in terms of maintaining the agenda that we sent them up there to accomplish? For example, the $15 an hour minimum wage struck down by the Senate, but ostensibly could be forced back into the legislation if about 6 Congress people in the House actually leverage their power. What do you say to that potential strategy, but also just to the broader conversation of how do we hold these people accountable when we send them up there on our behalf?
Yeah, well, I'm going to put that there's an onus on our champions, right, for sure, to deliver. But I want to talk a little bit more about the onus for our movements, because those champions, Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and there's more, and they're growing, and they're also growing in state houses, which is also important across the country. We have to pay attention there. They want to have cover from us. They want to have a demand from us. They want our movements to be out there, organized, changing the common sense, making and articulating a popular demand, right? Because that's the only way they're going to be able to leverage power to get things done, right? So in some ways, accountability is one lens to look at it through, but and it can be an important lens, right? There's sometimes you elect somebody and they're just not doing what you want them to do. I don't think that's really the situation we're at with those champions that I just named. These are folks who I think are pretty fundamentally accountable to the movement, who want to do more. They don't have enough people in Congress to do more. And our movements still aren't strong and strategic enough to be making the demand and winning the popular fights. I mean, we're in a hard situation. We're getting a foothold on power for the first time in decades in this country. Progressive forces, organized working class people, and the organizations that we built, right? So I think the last thing I would say with this, the scenario you mentioned is an interesting one. And I think what's really important to recognize about, 6 people in the House could hold this up to do X. The first thing to recognize about that scenario is that is a tactical, a question of tactics and strategy, right? It's not a question of principles and vision. And so that kind of stuff gets really complicated. There's not really easy, cut and dry moral answers, right? Like with the $15 an hour minimum wage, that is actually juxtaposed with a relief bill that people are desperately waiting for, that will make a huge difference in people's lives. So it's like, I don't want to cut people too much slack, and it's not our job as movements to cut slack. It's our job to make demand and let them sort it out. So I think that's what we should keep doing, is focus on our part, building power, building our voice, making the demand, changing the common sense.
One last question for you before we get out of here. I want you to help the people understand 2 things. The concept of the ascendancy of progressivism, despite there's a lot of people who are still feeling like we're not getting anywhere. And I think you, at least our first conversation, you vehemently disagree with that. You believe that we're in a stronger position now than before. I want you to speak to that, but then also speak to the people in the audience in terms of how they can help the progressive movement.
Yeah, thanks. I think that just to dial it back a second, I want to be clear. I'm not like Pollyanna here, like everything's rosy. We're on an inevitable path to increased, to winning things. I think we're in an incredibly precarious place as a country. I think that if Democrats right now don't deliver in a pretty big way in the next 2 years, we're going to have right now, Republicans are in disarray, but we're going to have a retrenchment. We're going to have somebody like Josh Hawley or some other authoritarian who doesn't have all the baggage of Trump. We're going to have them come back with a vengeance. And that's going to happen if the Democratic Party does not do things to visibly show that they are fighting for the working class base that is their traditional base. And by working class, I mean black, white, brown, rural, urban, right? That is how they are going to realign the electorate. And if they fail to do that, we are really screwed, right? So my cautious optimism is that the objective conditions of COVID, of the movements we've built over the past few years, the way we've changed the common sense on things like Black Lives Matter, Green New Deal, Medicare for all, even though, we're attacked constantly on those things still, we've really moved the goalposts and made these ideas popular or allowed working class people to realize, hey, that's going to benefit me. That's what making an idea popular is, right? And so we have the real potential because of that to accomplish some things, some big things.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be everything, right? We're going to have to prepare for the next wave. We're going to have to elect more champions and do more. But so that's my cautious optimism. But if we don't do that, I think we're in real trouble.
Absolutely. Jonathan Smucker, co-founder of Lancaster Stands Up, PA Stands Up, and Common Defense. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hey, thanks. A pleasure to be on, Ben.